Since May 15, a special envoy from China has been on a diplomatic tour of Ukraine, Russia, and Europe. This is the latest step in Beijing's efforts to broker peace in the Russia-Ukraine war, following President Xi Jinping's visit to Moscow in March. Why has China adopted the mantle of peacemaker? And can it succeed where the US has failed? Hello and welcome to a special edition of Insight, a panel discussion on China's recent diplomatic efforts on her ambition to be a global peacemaker. Why has China decided to take up the mantle of a peace broker? What does it hope to achieve? Why is there skepticism about China's motivations, and is the skepticism justified? I'm Genevieve Wu, and joining me today to search for some answers are Professor Melly Caballero-Anthony, Professor of International Relations and Head of Center for Non-Traditional Security Studies, S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. Dr. Ma Po, Senior Visiting Fellow, ISIS Yusof Ishak Institute, and Associate Professor at Nanjing University. Dr. Chong Jia-yin, Associate Professor of Political Science, National University of Singapore, and Non-Resident Scholar, Carnegie, China. And Dr. Benjamin Ho, Coordinator of the China Program at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. Welcome and thank you for joining our show. Let's begin with the Russia-Ukraine war. Now, Russia's invasion of Ukraine last year, February 22, and to date there's been more than 350,000 casualties combined. Now, when Xi Jinping visited Russia in Moscow earlier this year, there was high hopes and expectations that he would broker a peace between the two sides. Now, what has been the outcome of this very high-profile visit and the subsequent visit by the Defense Minister Li Shangfu to Moscow soon after? Melly, do you want to kick it off for us?
Yeah, thank you, Jen. Let me start by saying that any initiative to broker peace should really be appreciated, regardless of who does it, particularly in a very dire situation like what we see in Ukraine with, as you said, hundreds of thousands of people have already died, and I think conservatively over 5 million people have been displaced. So the initiative by China to speak to Putin, as I think, and also the phone call to President Zelensky are promising initiatives, but the outcome is really, indeterminate at the moment. I think what is important to appreciate is that some efforts are being done to at least speak to the two leaders. However, there are concerns about, or maybe reservations about the neutrality of China. If you're a peacemaker, you are expected to be neutral. And China, because of its failure to condemn the war in Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine, has appeared to be less than neutral.
Yeah, I think I agree with Professor Melly's comments on peace should be respected and should be encouraged, no matter who come to play these peacemaker roles. But regarding to your question, I think from my knowledge, the West was actually disbelief that China can play a role of peacebreaker to the Russian-Ukraine crisis from the beginning. But then I think their attitude changed to suspicious because they don't know what really happened in the back door between Putin and Xi Jinping's talk, given their very close personal relationship. And then eventually, I think recently, the West, some media has give the tone of supportive, and they believe China is a very important partner to end this war. So I think there is this change of attitude, and I don't think the West give very high hope that Xi Jinping China will play actually the very defining role in ending the war.
And why not? Why the skepticism that the West has about and the hopes?
Well, my view, and this is where I might differ a bit from Melly's point, what China is basically trying to do is that it is trying to claim the moral high ground. And this is really in terms of a comparison where it points to the United States and saying, you guys are the ones supplying Ukraine with weapons and everything, and to problematize this war and to muddle it further. Whereas just because we did not condemn doesn't mean we are supporting. So I think this is where China's so-called neutrality still has some kind of basis in the sense that what they're saying is that let's just see who is really doing what on the ground.
Any peacemaker, the PRC included, needs to simultaneously solve three problems, right? The first is the Europeans want some sort of strategic restraint from Russia, some sort of credible promise that Russia, if the war stops, will not go back to using aggression again.
Indeed.
The Ukrainians want that, but they also want their territory back. And the Russians, because of the way that Putin has really enveloped himself in this rhetoric that the war is, for Russia's survival, is existential, they need to reclaim the territory, it's key to Russian security, want to have some ability to demonstrate success. So for any peacemaker, including the PRC, they have to be able to deliver on all these three fronts simultaneously. Otherwise, there's not going to be a meeting of minds among the various parties, and any sort of effort, I think, will probably not move along very far.
But at the same time, I think when we say, can Beijing deliver, it's really something that's asking too much at this stage, because I think what you would do if you're a peacemaker in a highly volatile situation is to ensure at least a very, very modest gains in trying to see whether you can even get the two parties to speak, right? And I think that's very important. So you have to be able to tell Russia to stop, right? Or even Ukraine to stop violence. I mean, there's normal rules of engagement. You no longer recognize even, schools which are supposed to be no-goes, or even hospitals, and it's changing the whole nature of war, so to speak, the rules of engagement. So I think principles have to be laid out, and I think that wasn't very clear. They didn't come out in the 12 whatever steps that President Xi has mentioned.
So speaking of the 12-point peace plan that Xi Jinping did bring up in his meeting with Putin, I mean, some of the points that he called for was, of course, it's a call for, of course, peace, respect for sovereignty, no use of nuclear arms. But what was missing in the 12-point plan was the withdrawal of Russian troops. And that was very different from the UN General Assembly's plan that happened just before that. Why is China not calling for Russian withdrawal?
China has quite limited influence on Russia's war with Ukraine, as China's Minister Qin Gang actually mentioned quite a few times. China is not a party of the war. It wants to play some constructive role, but everybody knows nowadays the war is between Russia, Ukraine, and the US. Actually, that's what happened right now. So I think if China jumps in to ask what you said, that why not withdraw your troops first, I think that will further isolate Vladimir Putin, which may not result in a feasible outcome, and it might actually make Russia feel more isolated.
So I slightly disagree with my friend Mabo by saying that I don't think that the US is party to the war, but I do recognize his point that not talking about withdrawal, that's the sort of third set of the three problems I talked about. Because if you're talking about withdrawal now, it's not something that Putin or I think the Russian public under Putin's influence can accept. So if you put that on the table, that will probably kill any chance for a deal. Moscow will probably reject it. So that unfortunately can't be on the cards for now.
Okay, then if that's the case, what leverage does China actually have on Putin to push for peace?
Well, I think definitely President Xi Jinping and Putin have very close personal relationships. In the past couple of years, the Chinese government have been calling this leadership diplomacy, meaning that the role played among leaders are very important in facilitating deals among countries.
Yeah, but I don't necessarily call it leverage, but what is it that China can offer and to gain that kind of trust and confidence as far as Russia is concerned, although as media reports have said, they're actually very, very close, right? It's the fact that, for Russia that has suffered a lot of sanctions already, access to resources, in exchange, of course, for Beijing also getting a steady supply of oil, and allowing this flow of goods into China it's like a lifeline, an economic lifeline that at this stage Russia really needs a lot.
So you're absolutely right, Melly, that the Russians need the Chinese for hard currency. They need the Chinese for chips to put into their military equipment, and that's very crucial. But I think on the other side, if you look at Russia, they've made this conflict, well, at least Putin has made this conflict existential for his regime, right? So that means to say that Putin is probably willing to take a lot of pain before he gives in. So on the Chinese side, they have to ask themselves, at what point do they want to put pressure before they lose leverage? But if Putin digs his heels in, they may lose that leverage. So I don't think it's particularly easy for the Chinese to decide either.
One other consideration we need to factor in is that not all Chinese actions are meant for Putin or for the international stage. A lot of it is also for domestic posturing. So I think China also doesn't want to be seen as trying to force the hand of Putin in case it doesn't work, and that will reflect quite badly on the Chinese government.
Let's talk quickly about Ukraine, of course, the other side of the divide. Ukraine and Xi Jinping's phone call to Zelensky in April. Now, what came out of that phone call, and what's your take on the reactions to that phone call by Ukraine itself and the rest of the world?
The Ukrainian public has become a lot more skeptical of the PRC over the course of the war, in part because many of them, I think, initially had much greater hopes for the PRC. And there's also some reference to the 2013 treaty between Ukraine and the PRC, where one of the articles talks about how if there's a threat to sovereignty on either side, the two sides would come together and discuss joint countermeasures. That obviously didn't happen. So I think among the public, there's a lot more skepticism, maybe some disappointment with the PRC. It's not fatal, of course, but it depends on what Beijing is able to deliver. So I suppose President Zelensky's ask is actually an invitation for Beijing to show something.
I think the time has to be right for President Xi to call Zelensky. If there's really nothing to offer, there's no worse to phone call, right? I think if you look at what happened before the phone call, it was their meeting with Putin and meeting with Macron from EU, and also the EU's top leaders, one of the top leaders of the European Union, to get a general idea is what all the party wants. So after you collect all these informations, then you might actually facilitate this kind of phone call with Zelensky. I think this is the first after the war, but it will not be the last. So there will definitely be a working relation between the two countries in the days to come.
Well, hold that thought for now. And while we wait to see if the overtures from Xi Jinping to Putin and Zelensky will bear fruit coming up soon, China did manage to score a peace deal between two major rivals in the Middle East, Iran and Saudi Arabia. When we come back, we'll discuss how China pulled that off. Welcome back to a special edition of Insight, a panel discussion on China as a global peacemaker. Before visiting Russia in March earlier this year, China pulled off a peace deal in the Middle East between two major rivals, Iran and Saudi Arabia. Now, Iran is a majority Shiite Muslim country at loggerheads with Saudi Arabia, a Sunni majority, for decades. And they've been fighting proxy wars in Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq. So how significant was this peace deal?
The fact that the Chinese were able to pull these two countries together is certainly very much noted. For a long time, the Middle East has traditionally been a very difficult region diplomatically. Countries have tried to play some kind of role. The United States have tried, didn't do very well. So I think the fact that China did manage to get the two leaders to have a handshake, I think that has to be acknowledged as certainly some kind of diplomatic victory. But that said, I think we need to be careful how we don't want to overinterpret these things, because this is just the beginning of a long journey ahead.
Interesting to that point then, what were then Iran and Saudi Arabia's personal interests or own interests for signing on this?
I think for those two countries, they are able to make approachments so they can develop their own national strategies, which concern them the most. For instance, the Saudi have these 2030 visions to develop its own economy and be a good player of the global security and the economic. For Iran, it has been under this sanction from the West for many years. So now it wants to improve its relation with neighbors and focus on its domestic issues. So I think China just found the right opportunities at this moment. Yeah.
I think for the first time, perhaps, that you really have a trend in Chinese foreign policy where they are now going into areas which before they didn't have any presence, right? So, and that is, I mean, the Middle East has, you have seen the US in the Middle East for the last 70 years, right? So now China, I guess, in keeping with its new stature, as part of its initiative, the Global Security Initiative, finds it important to also, have a role in the Middle East, a role that is, I guess, welcomed by countries in the Middle East from the perspective of the kind of transition that is taking place in Saudi Arabia. You now have a crown prince that obviously wants to show that you're not just reliant solely on one power, you want to diversify, you want to also hedge.
So the fact that China brokered this deal, is it a sign of waning US influence, or is that overstating it?
So I think it reflects a certain change in the U.S. role in the Middle East. I'd also be careful about calling this a peace deal. I mean, it's basically an unfreezing of relations, a reestablishment of diplomatic ties. A lot of the friction in Yemen is still going on. That having been said, I think what we are also observing is that before, the U.S. was far more invested in the Middle East and in its relationship with Saudi Arabia because of its greater dependence on Middle Eastern oil. But as the United States becomes more energy independent, there is less of a need, I think, to perhaps put as much on the table in the Middle East as before. So perhaps the Riyadh recognizes this as well. And in comparison, despite China's own efforts at investing in renewables, it is and looks to remain a major sort of importer of energy from the Middle East. And perhaps from that perspective, both Riyadh and Tehran recognize that maybe working with the PRC under these changed circumstances may be more helpful.
If you also want to push the analysis further, when you say, is this an indication of the decline of the U.S., maybe you could see the decline perhaps of the U.S. leadership in that part of the world. I mean, when you talk about, when you think about the, during the time of President Trump, when he basically didn't want to be seen to be investing in the Middle East. And this is what I say, the frustration of Saudi Arabia when there was no retaliatory action for the United States. And the impression, the optics that resulted as a result of the way they have withdrawn, for example, from Afghanistan. So the question is the U.S., I think if you're Saudi Arabia, you would ask yourself the question, is the U.S. a reliable partner?
I think you can add that to Iran as well, with the U.S. withdrawing from the nuclear deal.
Yes.
That has created an impression that the U.S. may not be a worthwhile or reliable interlocutor.
Country in the Middle East, country in Africa, even country in Latin America, felt they're being ignored by the US and by the West. So at this time, I think building on this strong economic tie between China and this region, they actually want to bring someone new to help them to facilitate some peace deal or solve their problem.
And I would even flip this and say that right now China, for a long time, it sees itself as a purely regional power, but now it has ambitions of a global power. And part of the ambitions of a global power is to go into areas where the previous global power, if you call the US, did not succeed. And I think this is very telling that the Chinese have even ambitions to go into the Middle East, notwithstanding the problems in the Middle East. So I would say that's really a good reflection of China's global ambitions. And the Middle East is one area where any claims to global ambitions, you've got to be part of the Middle East situation.
Emmanuel Macron of France also recently said that Europe should not be a vassal of the US. Is that also another indication that the US influence is waning? Does Macron speak for Europe or not?
Well, I just jump in. So my quick response is that all this talk about US reliability and whether it is a decline, it is also a sensing that countries would rather prefer the US to be involved as opposed not to get involved. Otherwise, why are we raising questions about US reliability? The fact is that you only raise questions about reliability is because there is a certain expectation that the United States needs to be around, because we don't know of any other alternatives. I'm not sure whether China wants to play the same role the US has.
So, I mean, the point there too, right, is it's a legacy of the Trump administration and also the continuing infighting in the US that gives, I think, a lot of US allies, partners, friends, and others a lot of reason to question US commitment. But that having been said, I think on Europe, the very strong response in opposition to Macron's statements suggests that many Europeans still do see a need for a US role in Europe, at least.
I thought the comment, and I could be wrong, was really because it was in response to Taiwan, right? So we don't want to be a vassal state in the sense that we don't want to be involved in other people's war.
I think the problem now in the West, or our understanding toward the West, particularly China's understanding, is there are actually different actors in the NATO, in the West. So I think for Biden's policy is to have this global alliance, but actually it actually ignored each alliance interest. So we're seeing what they've been quite successfully doing here is the AUKUS and this Quad. But if you look at this, they're all so-called Anglo spheres countries. And they consult the French, they consult the German, and what their interests. I think the Americans are now paying very little attention to it.
China has also announced that it hopes to broker peace between Israel and Palestine. Very quickly, how possible or how realistic is this going to be?
And I think the dynamics in the Palestine-Israeli conflict is, I think, far more different from when you talk about the conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia, for example. And you're looking at a bilateral security relations that have stood the test of time. And I'm talking about the US and Israel. So it's interesting. I won't pour cold water over it, but it's interesting to see how this will evolve.
Can I just jump in? I think this is a fascinating topic because I've also read articles suggesting that China's image in Middle East is a pretty positive one. A lot of Middle East countries view China with a certain level of positively, be it because of vaccine diplomacy or even more broadly through their prism of their own, I guess maybe more complicated relationship with the United States and the West. So I think on that part, it's hard to say for sure whether the possibility of a peace deal between Israel and Palestine is possible, but except to note that this public opinion towards China in Middle East is more favorable than elsewhere in the world.
And we'll hold a thought there for now. And despite China's overtures and peacemaking plans around the world, there is trouble brewing in its own backyard. How will conflicts in China's own neighborhood impact on China's global image? We'll talk about that when we return. Welcome back. You're watching Insight, a special edition where we discuss China's ambition to be a global peacemaker. Now, earlier this year, China released the Global Security Initiative concept paper. Now, very briefly, the stated goals are to eliminate the root causes of international conflicts, to improve global security governance, to encourage joint international efforts to bring more stability and certainty to a volatile and changing era, and to promote world peace, right? Very lofty goals, is a peace manifesto. But because of what's happening in its own region, some are skeptical of China's proclamations. So let's start with the South China Sea. Does China's continued claims in the South China Sea undermine its own global security message?
Well, For me, yes, it does, because there's a clear disconnect in the principles that you have espoused, talking about respect for sovereignty, non-use of force. And much of these pronouncements in the GSI really falls flat when you're looking at China's action, increased militarization, and the building of installations in the South China Sea, and really the encroachment in the maritime zones of littoral states. The very fact that you do not respect the rights of claimant states really goes against your pronouncements about mutual respect, mutual coexistence, talking about common security, etc.
Well, what do you feel, the
Yeah,
disconnect?
I think South China Sea issue is definitely the issue that the neighboring states are closely watching, particularly when China launched this global security initiative. I think it will be paying more closer attention on what China will do in solving this dispute. But let me emphasize that since the 2016 South China Sea Arbitration Award came out, relatively the situation in the South China Sea has been quite peaceful, I think, for the past couple of years. That's number one. And number two, I think for currently, many of the leaders in this region actually show supportive or constructive role in this global security initiative. For instance, Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong and Prime Minister Anwar from Malaysia just visited Beijing last month, and they both used the supportive tone on this global security initiative, along with global development initiative.
If you were the Philippines, where your fishermen are being harassed and you have laser beams, targeted at the coast guards, and you have all of this, I mean, it's hard to say it's a peaceful seas. Yeah.
Right. I mean,
There'll be tensions, but I think still peaceful.
well, I mean, I don't think it's become, at least from the Southeast Asian vantage point, I don't think the situation on the South China Sea has become more peaceful. Maybe it looks that way in Beijing. I think when you look at what Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim and Lee Hsien Loong articulated when they were in China, in the PRC, I think those articulations demonstrate more a desire to placate and not agitate Beijing rather than sort of heartfelt support. At least that's one possible reading, because there is, I think, some concern that a Beijing that is easily upset, that is willing to sometimes apparently arbitrarily punish other actors, Australia, South Korea, etc., is one that you need to treat very carefully. I think the main question surrounding the PRC is its commitment to strategic restraint. Now, why is the focus on the PRC? Is because it's the largest actor, it has the most capabilities. This commitment to strategic restraint is important because there's sufficient doubt over China's willingness to commit. Why do I say this? There's a view to the whole process, the arbitral tribunal process, and the final and China's response to the final decision, which rejected it. There's a continued arming of the features that China has occupied and reclaimed, and this goes against the explicit promise that State Chairman Xi made to President Obama in 2015. There was the 2012 arrangement that the Filipinos, Americans, and the PRC had made over Scarborough Shoal, that they'd all withdraw, but then the PLA came back. So this creates an impression that the PRC, that Beijing may make promises, but it's just too easy to walk back on them. So without that commitment to strategic restraint, I think forward progress may be a little bit more difficult, and regional states may feel a little more easily intimidated.
It's a question of principle, right? You do have international law, you have the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and being a signatory to that, China should respect that, right? And if there are if countries take you to international tribunal in respect of institutions, you must abide by this.
All right, now speaking of conflict in China's backyard, the big one, of course, is Taiwan, right? And Xi Jinping has repeated and not shied away from saying that it will be reunified by force if necessary. Surely these are not the words of a peacekeeper. Mabo, what do you think?
So I think peaceful unification still have been given the priority for China's strategy to reunify Taiwan. And also, I think since the issue has been very pressing in the past few years. So you look back, actually the U.S. has been calling, giving warning shots to all regional states that China want to take Taiwan back militarily. That has been well documented and mentioned. President Biden actually said 4 times that the U.S. want to defend Taiwan if being attacked. So things we all know that this is China's so-called one China principle. Here it's called one China policy. But it's really the red line for China to conduct any diplomatic relation with another countries. So I think this is the issue that China takes very seriously.
China has always claimed Taiwan as an internal issue. So in that sense, it doesn't contradict its role as a global peacemaker, because this is not a global international issue. This is a domestic affair. Obviously, countries around the region will probably not agree, but I think this is where the Chinese government was just justified as this is our own domestic affairs, and they have the right to do so.
Well, that's Beijing's claim, obviously.
Yeah.
But I think if you're looking at any instability in the region over Taiwan, it would affect the region. So you're thinking about shipping, air lanes between Northeast and Southeast Asia. You're thinking about submarine cables. All these would be affected. So the region is deeply entrenched in whatever Beijing calls the differences with Taiwan. And moreover, what people on Taiwan are seeing are lots of military flights, lots of naval operation exercises near them, and it is creating more suspicion, more skepticism, and less willingness to come under Beijing's control.
I'd like to pick up on what Ian has said about building trust. And that is one characteristic, one element of a peaceful power, right? And you cannot simply just say it is an internal matter. So even if we use force, it's none of your business, because any use of force, again, goes to the very principle that you have espoused, yes? And if you were the people of Taiwan, all the constant intimidation, right, just eats into the kind of trust. Trust has to be earned if you are, especially if you're seen as a regional power, not just to mention a global power. And in a way, one could argue that it will actually backfire.
Right, and the extension to that is if China is willing to contemplate force on what it sees as its domestic matter. So on issues that aren't domestic matters,
like South China Sea,
would it be more willing to escalate? Yeah. So those are the questions that are in people's minds.
If that's the case, one might expect Southeast Asian countries to view Chinese claims on Taiwan and the threats of force as something that would erode trust between themselves and China. But I don't know Southeast Asian countries. I'm not sure if they view that as a case whereby just because China has threatened the use of force, therefore we trust China less.
Once you establish diplomatic relation with PRC, by default you recognize one China principles, meaning Taiwan is a domestic issue for China. So I think this is the thing I think I need to
well, that's not true. For instance, if you look at the U.S. one China policy, the U.S. acknowledges that Chinese on both sides of the strait say there's one China, right? That's the U.S. one China policy. If you look at the Singapore one China policy, Singapore recognizes the PRC. It recognizes, accepts that Taiwan is part of China, but it doesn't also have this other clause that some others have, which is seeing the PRC as the sole legitimate government of China is more ambivalent on that. So on the one China policies, in the plural, there's a lot of variation, and they're not the same. If this is a sort of diplomatic sleight of hand to establish relations.
That's actually tension why the Taiwan Strait issue will be very escalating at this moment, is that they are very disagree on what this one China principle or policy is, right? But
no,
I think
we know
that
what the
will
China principle is.
That will cause actually conflicts among this region. It's a very serious issue, I think.
Well, so
I have to admit.
Right. So the one China policy, one China principle, which is PRC, that's pretty clear. It's the question is whether others have the ability to determine what their own policies are. Beijing disagrees with various governments, agrees with some other governments on that.
But I think in practical level, I think only the U.S. government has openly said that we want to defend Taiwan. If you ask the Australian Foreign Minister, Penny Wong just clearly said that our cooperation with the U.S. will not involve in Taiwan issues.
So clearly, even in China's own backyard, there is ambiguity. How should we trust that China can broker peace elsewhere? Maybe just a quick thought from each of you.
Well, my short answer is always it's harder to be peaceful domestically than outside. I mean, we see that in all sorts of examples. So I would say because there is a much greater stakes within your own region as opposed to outside the region where the stakes might be lesser.
So the PRC is an interested party in disputes in the region, right? In places where it's not an interested party, it probably has more flexibility. And so this, of course, comes back to my issue about being able to commit to strategic restraint. That's what I think will build sufficient trust. And that's something that I think we are waiting for Beijing to demonstrate.
Yeah.
Well, in reality, I think China's last time of largely used force, is 1979, the border war with Vietnam, right? So the past 40 years, you don't really see PRC really launch attacks on another country for all kinds of issues.
That's the false equivalence argument, right? Well, I agree with the point that it's harder to have peace in your own backyard. But you can be peaceful if you exercise restraint. You can be peaceful if you do not threaten or intimidate your neighbors.
Thank you for these great differences in opinions. That makes for a really good debate. But in the end, whatever gains that China makes in terms of its peace brokerage, be it closer to home or further ashore, all its actions will be measured against what the US does. Now, are all these talks then just an extension of superpower rivalry? We'll talk about that when we come back. Thank you for staying with us. You're watching a special edition of Insight, a panel discussion on China's ambition as a global peacemaker. Now, China has been recently ramping up its diplomatic efforts, now taking up the mantle of peacemaker in Ukraine and Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and possibly even wading into Israel and Palestine. Now, in doing so, China has flipped the script, so to speak. Now, it is painting America as the source of global conflict. On numerous occasions, it has called US a troublemaker. What is your assessment then of China's criticism of US foreign policy? Has the US indeed been destabilizing global security?
I'll just jump in. I think, I guess it's not difficult to criticize US foreign policy because Americans themselves have been criticizing their own country's foreign policies. And I think what China has effectively done is to sort of made use of all these criticisms out there, be it from the international community or from Americans themselves, and to marry it with their own form of sort of ethno-nationalism, to characterize it as not just a political challenger, but an ideological challenger, and essentially causing a lot of problems that you are seeing.
So, I mean, again, I agree with Ben that it's easy to criticize US foreign policy, that it's been very involved in lots of things, and sometimes to very bad effect. If you think about the aftermath of the 2003 invasion and occupation of Iraq, the aftermath of the US presence in Afghanistan. But I think all this comes as a price of being a major actor in the world that tries to provide some sort of order, and of course the benefits of those order are not distributed evenly. So the PRC, I suppose, has benefited a lot from being integrated in that sort of world order for a long time, but now it's become a major power. Like other major powers before it, it seeks to perhaps make some adjustments. But the question then is, what sort of alternative order is the PRC providing? Perhaps the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, and the Global Civilizational Initiative are intended to provide this sense of order, but those remain to be filled out, right? They are right now conceptual. How they work out in terms of institutions and details and things like restraint and commitment remain to be seen.
Mm-hmm. Now, if China achieves more security victories in the months ahead, say for example Russia and Ukraine, maybe even Israel-Palestine, it makes some headway. What does it mean for the rest of the world? Does it mean that China has increased its stature? Does it mean that China's sphere of influence would have expanded greatly?
Well, I think it is good for the rest of the world if there's actually peace in the Middle East. And it is also fitting with China's pronouncement of being a responsible global powers. So on the one hand, that's really something to be welcome. But the question, as I would like to pick up on what Ian raised earlier about, so if you keep on criticizing the US for being a warmonger, this is why Donald Trump was saying, you expect so much from us and our role is not being appreciated. I mean, that's on the one hand. But if you criticize the Western order, Western-led order, what is the alternative? And China has not, I think, articulated the alternative to a Western-led order.
I think regarding this peacemaking business, I think China is really a newcomer. I think it's still learning. Particularly, I think they might actually learning some experience or mistake from the US. So I wouldn't say the aim that high in mediating Ukraine-Russia conflicts or even Israeli-Palestinian conflicts. I think China can gradually, incrementally build some credentials. For instance, what I have been saying is maybe China can break a peace deal between diplomatic rapprochement between Malaysia and North Korea, because currently they don't have foreign relations, and maybe play an important constructive role in Myanmar issues. So I think maybe China can do this doing this incrementally to build up this experience and have some credentials. That's more like a feasible route to me.
So how those incremental steps fit together and accumulate remains a question that is unresolved. And the other point too is what we've seen with major powers as they try to make more global forms of order and arrangement and governance is when China as a superpower tries to move forward on these kinds of arrangements, when it runs into problems, when countries renege, when it gets blamed for problems, how it would react is not something that we've seen yet.
Are we then looking at a bipolar world? Even when it comes to peace, it's become competitive. Are we looking at a bipolar world, and what does it mean?
I think if you ask a different person, a different country, they will give you different answers. I think still many American decision makers, they believe that it's still a unipolar world. With the US in the top, making the rules and so-called liberal internationalism. And also if you ask China, it will emphasize its multipolar world, right?
Right?
Yeah.
If you talk about the distribution of capabilities, distribution of power, then maybe we're getting to maybe a bipolar world. But if you're talking about a bipolar world, meaning one that's bifurcated like the Cold War, I think the world right now is a lot more integrated to make that kind of a move more costly and more difficult.
Yeah, I agree. If you're talking about distribution of power, yes, or you're talking about two poles, we're not there yet. We'll probably be there. But it's also a bit, there has to be some nuance. There are countries that may not have the same power parity with the US and with China, but play equally influence, right? You're looking at India, you're looking at Japan, you're looking at Australia. Our powers that are actually making influence, that are also participating in ensuring that a rules-based order is actually observed. So, and it's really different from the kind of Cold War bipolar world that we had in the past.
I'll just jump in. I mean, to paraphrase a very well-known political scientist, polarity is what states make of it. So if you go by that logic, it really depends on the political worldview of the countries involved in this geopolitical competition. And it goes back to my earlier point about whether it's an inclusive worldview or an exclusive. If it's an exclusive one with very high fences, then by definition, it is going to be segregated based on some kind of, whether it's bipolar or tripolar. But if it's an inclusive one, then I would say there are far more opportunities for that kind of multipolarity spheres of influence being played out as opposed to sort of a two-system kind of outcome.
All right, at this point then, I'm just going to go around the room and I'll just like your final thoughts to our topic for today. What are your thoughts on China's ambitions to be a global peacemaker?
Well, I think from what we have mentioned earlier, my sensing is that China does have certain ambitions to move up that ladder. It wants to play a greater role. But I think that's where it will run into some structural problems, as Ian earlier mentioned. What are the alternatives? It's easy to criticize, as Melly mentioned also, what is wrong with the current order. But it's not so easy to formulate a new order because that requires writing of rules, underwriting of rules, whether you're willing to preserve and the extent to which you are willing to go to even sacrifice for these rules. So I think those are tough questions that China would have to face at some point if indeed it wants to move up that ladder chain.
Right, so I see the PRC as a great power, and like other great powers, it wants to have its imprint. But the question is what the process looks like. Whether it's one that is more negotiated, whether it's one where the PRC demonstrates clear and credible commitment to self-restraint, has mechanisms for de-escalation, has rules that not only underwrites but also abides by itself. Major powers, they have a very spotty track record in terms of trying to keep to those. You can argue that the US has done slightly better than others, but still it faces that fundamental problem. China, too, as a major power, will face those issues.
I think the word of peace in today's world is both a treasure and also a luxury. So I think there won't be a competition for peace. I think the more actors, particularly the bigger states, jump to this peacemaking business will be beneficial to everyone.
Yeah. Well, I think we can expect China to really play a big role. I mean, this is why you have the GSI, you have the GDI, which I think you don't forget. I think the idea that security is development will find a lot of traction, not just in this part of the world, but in many parts of the world. But what is important, I think, for a peaceful world, you can have a cold peace, as some people would say. You can have two countries, they can cooperate, they can compete, right? But at the same time, minimize or mitigate any confrontation.
All right. Yeah. There's been so many interesting perspectives, so many diverse opinions. There's a lot for us to chew on. And we will just have to wait and see what will come out of the Chinese peace proposals and where else will China step up its influence to broker peace. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us on this special episode of Insight on China as a global peacemaker. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.